Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Accelerator Podcast. As always, my name is Chris Ferns, and I will be your host. Folks, today we're going to be talking about birds, bees, and destinies. And I know you might hear birds and bees and some alarm bells start going off, but seeing as we're talking about such a thing, we thought it would be good to have an expert on the topic come in, which is why today we have Christy Herselman joining us. Christy, thank you so much for being here today.
It is such a privilege to be with you.
Awesome, fantastic. Christy, for those of us at home who don't know you or what it is you do, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
So about 10 years ago, I founded a movement called The Chat. And I basically started it to empower parents to have the conversations they found hard to have. And one of the hardest conversations for us as parents is to talk about sex. It's often something we weren't spoken to about. We don't know how to do it. As you say, alarm bells start going off in your head, you start to sweat. And so it kind of started with that, how to help parents talk to their kids about sex in an age-appropriate, natural manner. And then quite quickly, it kind of spread out into other spaces because I realized that the digital space was having such an impact on the way our kids thought about sex, the education they were getting around sex. And so I started educating parents in how to raise their children to be safe, wise, and kind online. And then I also take on the big topics that are tricky for parents, the things like pornography, the gender conversation, identity, those kinds of things. So I speak to children, I speak at schools, I speak to parents, I do podcasts and those kinds of things. I've also written a few books, basically just to break open conversations in homes.
Fantastic. Yeah, and I think it's so crucial because we see it in schools and even in workspaces, how it almost becomes this taboo thing to talk about sex and identity, and even more so with children, obviously. But could you tell us a bit more about the social pressures a lot of kids face when it comes to sex and identity, and how we can go about promoting a healthier conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of the pressure is not really even overt pressure. It's just underlying social pressure of the norms that are around them. So our children are probably growing up in the most complicated sexual landscape that's ever existed. We do have the different gender conversations and gender ideologies coming out. But even aside from that, when I grew up in the 90s, 2000s, there was the social researchers call that hookup culture. That's what I grew up in, where sex became very casual. Sex became something more recreational. It had moved out of the space of marriage in the 80s, 70s and 80s, and kind of a hookup culture became quite common. But it's even got more complicated since then with the redefinition of what sex is, the redefinition of gender, and the biggest thing that's happened in the last 10 years is the digital space and how pornography is literally everywhere. And even if our children are not exposed to pornography in the mainstream porn sites and stuff like that, it is shaping sexual culture. So our children are growing up in what has been dubbed porn culture, which basically means that sex is not even just recreational anymore. There's often elements of coercion and violence and all sorts of very toxic and dangerous norms are slipping into culture. And so as our children grow up in that, and especially if their parents hand them a phone at a young age, or even at school, because they're surrounded by other kids with phones, those norms around sex are creeping in. And often they are in direct opposition to how sex was created by God.
I'm glad you mentioned the social space, because I would like to touch on in a bit more detail how exactly spaces like Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and all those other platforms are shaping kids' sense of identity and thoughts around sex, and then in more detail, the damage pornography itself is doing.
Okay, so if you think about when I was growing up, at least, I was the generation that I grew up in did not have phones. I got my first phone when I was 25. I had a work phone before that, but But now we have a generation, so our Gen Zs were the first generation to grow up with social media and with devices. And so now there's a lot of research going on to say, well, what is the impact of that? So our first lot of Gen Zs are now adults, they're in their early 20s. And then we have our Gen Alphas and our Gen Betas who are kind of starting this year. And the Gen Alphas, of course, they've had social media and devices since the womb.
Yes, yeah.
So they're even more so. But there's a lot of research now that asks that question, what is the impact? And so in terms of sexuality, the impact is, number one, parents no longer have control over the information that their children have access to. If children are curious, even whether or not children are asking their parents questions, children are curious. And a lot of the time, especially around sex, because there is still this kind of taboo feeling around it. Often when a child hears a word on the playground or gets sent something or whatever, they don't talk to their parents about it. And unfortunately, a lot of parents are still not talking to their kids about healthy sex. So if a family has had conversations about healthy sex, then it's a lot easier for those kids when they get exposed online or on the playground to come home and say, Mom, what does this word mean? Or someone sent me this link and it took me to the scary website. But a lot of parents aren't doing that still in this day and age, not talking to their kids about sex. And so what happens is children's education around sex is often something that's damaging, that's toxic, that's even traumatizing to children. The average age a South African child is exposed to porn is 10. And a lot of parents are not even having, if they are having conversations around sex, they're having them later than that. I have conversations with schools all the time. So on average, a school, if they do sex education, if they want to teach children about sexual intercourse, they're doing it in grade 7. And I'm saying to schools, that's way too late. I have a program called Sex at School, the Chat at Schools, and I do it in grade 5, I talk about puberty, grade 6 about sex, and grade 7 around the online stuff, because they say 8 is too late. If you haven't spoken to your kids about sex by the time they're 8, they've heard from somewhere else. But a lot of parents are still in that mindset of, if I talk to my child about sex, I'm going to steal their innocence from them. But what's happening is, because children are being exposed to, whether it's full-blown porn and nudity on a porn site, or just the stuff that's existing on Instagram, on Snapchat, on YouTube, that is very sexual in nature, even if it's just that becomes their norm. And as we were saying just now, the norm is not healthy. The norm is very unhealthy right now. It's you're not going to find, well, you will find it on Instagram if you look hard enough. You know, the great accounts like Moral Revolution and all those guys who are promoting healthy sex. But that's not what your teenager, that's not what your child is going to be exposed to.
Sure. They're
going to be exposed to things like the Bop House, which is a house full of porn star girls who look like cute little content creators, but actually, you know, they're on sites like OnlyFans, and then, you know, we see these kind of challenges around kissing and dating, and so a lot of what they're being exposed to, it has that underlying sexual culture of hooking up, of you know, disregarding consent, and a lot of those kinds of things. So yeah, so our children are being sexualized earlier, especially if children are getting exposed to social media and phones before high school, which is obviously not a great idea, but becoming more and more common. They're getting this information way too soon, and the information they're getting is very damaging, and especially pornography. You can imagine, probably they say between 80 and 90% of pornography is violent in nature. So when our children are exposed to that, they're not seeing loving, safe, connected, consensual sex within a marriage as God designed it. They're seeing this kind of thing, and that's becoming their sex education. That's becoming, oh, this is what sex is, rather than them hearing that from their family. You know, this is how God designed sex. It's beautiful. It's worth waiting for. It's empowering. It's mutually pleasurable. It's designed by God within sex because it is so within marriage because it is so powerful. That isn't their foundation. Their foundation is what they're seeing online. And then often parents, if they do have the conversations at all, come in late, and it's almost like you have to do damage control rather than establishing healthy foundations. Yeah.
So speaking of damage control, if we as parents or educators or somebody involved in a young person's life find that a child has reached that stage where they've been exposed to these things, or they've had the conversation far too late, and they've really had their perception of what is normal warped, what steps can we take to do something about that?
Yeah, and that's the wonderful thing about the human brain, right? Is the human brain is elastic, especially when our children are young. The older you get, the less elastic your brain becomes. And we know the harder it is to learn things and change habits. But for children, it's easier than it will be at any other stage of their life. So the age between 12 and 14, 15 is the most impressionable on a brain. That's when you learn the fastest, and those norms become embedded in the neural pathways. And so the good news is that if you find out your child has been watching pornography or has developed some very unhealthy attitudes around sex or has believed the wrong thing, you can then help them to relearn. You can help them by having conversations, by having allowing them to ask questions, because a lot of children that I speak to who they've kind of got involved in consuming pornography or sexually active early, or they even they're just sending inappropriate messages. For a lot of them, they say they don't want to tell their parents because of, number one, their parents, these are the two things, their parents are going to be angry or their parents are going to be sad and disappointed. So I always say to young people, your parents' feelings and emotions, they're not your responsibility. They're adults. They can deal with that. And then on the flip side, I say to parents, your children are not coming to you because they feel that when they come to you with that issue, they now not only have to deal with the issue, but now they have to deal with your emotion and your reaction as well. And that's too much for them. And so I always recommend parents to practice their chat face. So when a child comes and said, Mom, I've been watching pornography, or I've just come across this website, or someone sent me a nude, or I sent a nude, or, I've had sex with my boyfriend, that we practice that chat face. We can't, lose our minds and start crying and start shouting and start blaming the boyfriend or, the influence, or wanting to take the child's phone away. Often we react, and often it comes out of us being scared and being almost feeling guilty that we haven't protected our child. So the best thing we can do is always to say to our child, thank you so much for coming to me. That must have been incredibly hard for you, and it was so brave. And I'm so grateful you came. And I often also say, perhaps I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you against this. Well, I'm so sorry you had to go through this. Let's figure out how to resolve the situation. Let's figure out how to fix it. And then a child feels like they're in that safe place where, yes, there may be consequences. And often when we make those mistakes, there are consequences. And that's part of learning and growing. But at least we feel we're going through that in the safety of being connected to our parents, which is where we should be. Our children should be growing up within a space where they feel connected to us. And so there is so much we can do. And then, of course, we pray with them. We ask God to help renew their minds. That's biblical. That the word tells us. The word tells us that when we repent, which basically means turning away from that to this, God throws our sins into the sea of forgetfulness, and He gives us that chance to start again. And what I've done with families is I've helped them sit with their children and pray, and Jesus, we give these thoughts to you that are not in my mind because of what I've seen. I give those to you, and I say, Lord, what are you going to give me in return? And often we have this peace that comes, this freedom that comes back to the child, this restoration of who they are and their true identity. And so what we don't do is we don't put our heads in the sand. We don't get angry. We don't hope it goes away by ignoring it. We don't say, go ask your mother or go ask your father. We step into that space with our child. We talk to them about it. We make them feel safe, and then we journey with them through that.
Yeah, absolutely, sure. I think that's tough thing to swallow as a parent. I think thinking back to when I was younger and how my parents handled it was very different to sort of the way you're describing. But I think in that there's a lot that we can take away from that as parents. But moving on from parents, I want to talk about the education space a bit more. At AE, we have our Smart Choices program, which is our Christian-based sexuality program for kids of all ages to really help them understand who they are and their bodies and what is safe and isn't safe. But I would love to hear from you about the power that these sexuality education programs can have in schools for these kids.
Yeah, and this is quite a complicated space, right? Because at a lot of our government schools, the education is very broad. And so as a Christian parent, you may not feel safe and comfortable with your child receiving that education, which I think is the beauty of the curriculum that you guys have,
yes,
is that it's rooted in the word, it's rooted in the truth of what God says about sex, and parents know that their children are getting, a good education. But I speak into a lot of different schools. So probably about 80% of the schools I speak to are not Christian schools. Some of them have a Christian ethos, but I honestly believe so much in the power of education. There's something called the law of first mention, which basically means the first time we get knowledge or information about something becomes our grid. So if our children are getting good, solid information about these taboo subjects as their grid, as their foundation, then as they journey through life, as they see something on their phone, as they encounter something, they have that. And it's almost that safety net. Yes, they're going to make mistakes. Yes, they're going to take risks. They're children. They're not going to get everything right all the time. But we really put them at an advantage when we do that. And I'm seeing more and more schools actually being brave in this space. And it is a tricky space. And it is a space, and honestly, for myself, for a long time, I stepped back from this. I said, okay, I'm going to educate parents to educate their kids. But then I realized that there's a lot of parents who are not going to do that. There's a lot of parents who either just don't have the courage, that it was never done for them, or they've suffered sexual trauma and the thought of having conversations is just too scary for them. And so having good sex education in schools is very, very important. It also, sometimes there's things that children don't want to talk to their parents about, but they might ask those questions. I mean, I do these programs in primary schools and I am amazed by the questions. We think kids are going to be awkward about this, but I think often they just, thank goodness, I've been so curious. Now I have somewhere to ask. And so, yes, the curriculum we offer is important, but equally important is creating space where children feel comfortable and realize that sex is just part of life. It's something we are going to talk about, and that there are educators around who will answer questions in a way that is godly, is healthy, and is going to kind of put to rest those curious thoughts that they're having. Because as I said, especially as children go through puberty, they are super curious. And one of the worrying things I'm finding, because I do a lot of work with teenagers, is we are having children get to 13, 14, 15, and they have so much sexual knowledge from online, but very little healthy sexual education. So they have all this like adult information in their heads and this huge lack of fundamental knowledge of what does a female body look like? What does a male body look like? What is sexual intercourse? All of that is missing. And so for me, that's also where this education is vital, that we do it in schools and that parents also then have those conversations at home. And even if your child is at a government school and, the curriculum they're getting might not be exactly in line with your values, what I recommend is that, and none of my children are in Christian schools. So what I do is I look at the curriculum they're getting at school, and then I have conversations at home. For example, my daughter's in matric and they're studying evolution at the moment. So we are having great conversations around creation versus evolution and all of these things. I think often as parents we've shied away from things that we don't know about, or maybe that clash with the word. But I think allowing our children to have those conversations, looking at the curriculum and going, okay, so what does the word of God say about this thing? And so a lot of parents in the past have pulled their kids out. So they're not even hearing other information. And I think maybe that's also out of fear. Because I feel like if we're at home, we're having the healthy conversations, then at school, they're at least hearing those things and they can understand them better and then stand more solid in their identity and in what they know to be true.
Amazing. So I think the big question then is, as a parent, an educator, a prominent community member, what is step one for me? What is the first thing I should be doing, looking into, to ensure that the children around me are developing that healthy sense of self and sex and all those sort of things?
So I think the first thing is creating a safe space. Creating a space where children can ask anything. And for parents, often we bring our mindset, our values, our worldview, and we raise our children in that as we should. It's important. But sometimes our children don't feel like they can ever doubt or question or ask. And so they don't do that in our space. They do that somewhere else. They do that with their friends at school or whatever. So I think whether it's in a classroom, whether it's at home, we create a safe space where our children can ask anything. And my first book is called The Chat Birds, Bees and Destinies, and that's what you referred to at the beginning. And after reading that book to her child, one mom wrote to me and she said, the best thing about this book is once I'd spoken about sex, I felt like I could talk about anything. And I think that's the first step. The first step is my children in my class, but predominantly my own children, feel like they can talk to me about anything. There's no question that's stupid. There's no question that they're going to feel ashamed of asking. That we answer those things openly. And also I think part of that safe space is looking at your own thoughts around sex, your own views of sex. When you think about talking about sex, do you start to sweat? And if you do, why? Is it just because of your lack of sexual education when you were growing up? Or is it because you suffered from sexual trauma? Is it maybe from a very domineering father figure in your life? And dealing with those things. Because I always say to parents, you can't create a safe space if you're taking all your baggage in there with you.
Yes.
So we've got to deal with that, whether we get counseling, however we talk about that, and we come to this space where our children can ask questions. And then we also come to that space being equipped. So, okay, what do you believe about these things? Why do you believe that? What do you understand about sex? How would you explain sex to your child? And so getting some resources, getting some, one of the things I put onto my website is a free age guide. Equipping yourself, because this is I mentioned it earlier, this is the tussle I often have with parents and educators, is the right age to talk about sexual intercourse with your child is between 7 and 9. To talk about like the act, the chat, the chat,
yes.
That one. So there's lots of chats that come before that and lots of chats that come after that. But 7 to 9, and actually I would err more towards 7 than 9, because if we're saying the average age of South African child seeing porn is 10, and a lot of children are getting what we call breaking the browser barrier, which means they're online without a parent, whether that's just Googling stuff for homework, having their own phone. Once you've broken the browser barrier, you need to have spoken to your kids about sex. So getting your head around those things, looking at an age guide, figuring out how you're going to have those conversations so that you can go in confidence. So you're kind of coming up with a game plan. Just going, okay, what is, and it doesn't always have to go like that, but knowing. And I do a talk for parents called the Chat 101, and it kind of takes you through these things. And okay, what if they ask me a question I don't know how to answer? What am I going to do? What if they ask a question that I feel is not age appropriate? Kind of what are some of the things? So I think it's about settling our own nerves, wrapping our own heads around it, so that we go into the conversations with confidence. And it's not about having the answer to every question. And I honestly believe that with raising kids, we often feel as parents we need to have all the answers for them. But I don't believe that. I think it's about being ready to engage in the conversations with them, for them feeling connected, feeling like they can talk to us. That's the win. And I've had times, I mean, this is my job, this is my calling. And I've had moments with my children where I've said, I actually don't know the answer to that, but give me some time and we'll talk about it. Or it's been just not the right time. I mean, I had a question from my daughter once while we were lifting some kids home from school. And I said to her, I'm not going to talk about that now, but we'll talk about it when we get home. And I often say, that's such a good question. And then when we got home, made lunch, sat at the kitchen table and said, remember that question you asked me? Let's chat about it. And so being willing, being equipped, putting our fears to rest, settling some of those myths, and just being available and present with our kids, I think is the first step.
Absolutely amazing. Wow. Thank you so much, Christy. I think we're going to wrap it up there. But before we go, please remind the folks at home who you are, what it is you do, and where they can find you.
Yeah, absolutely. So the chat is kind of I say we, but it's kind of me with some amazing help from my husband and a couple of other people. But so you can find me at thechat.co.za. That's my website, and then at the Chat Durban, Instagram, Facebook. But on my website, I have loads of different talks on different topics. I have 2 live talks coming up, one this week called The Chat Continues, one next month called Game On, because gaming's a whole other thing where a lot of even what we're talking about now is our children are being shaped even in the gaming space around their sexuality and around sex. So all my talks, I have my free downloads there. I write curriculums for schools, just like mini curriculums. I do talks at schools and for parents, and I'm doing a bit of a tour to Cape Town next month, in August. But yeah, I'm all over the show. Follow me. What I do often as well is when I see something in culture that I feel is a bit of a red flag, I jump on, I do a reel, tell some parents some stuff about what I'm feeling, how you can talk to your kids. But yeah, it's just all about having those conversations.
Oh, that's absolutely fantastic. Folks, to everyone at home, thank you so much for joining us for another episode. It was such a blast being able to talk about this, and I really hope you have learned something new, something interesting. If you are interested in chatting with Christy, her details will be on screen. Or if you want to know more about our Smart Choices program for your school, for your homeschool, you can find those details over here as well. Until then, we'll see you in the next episode.